Okay, cool. So we're going to do some detective work. I was scrolling through some examples and found this interesting motion blur effect using SVG filters. What's happening here? So there's a really cool image gallery. Every image gallery possible has been done. It's like the standard jQuery plugin is a cool image gallery. But look at this effect. You click and you get a swishy. It's not just like a standard CSS blur. It's a kind of whoosh where the motion seems to carry with the way the blur is actually happening. It's really interesting. I was trying to dig into what is actually going on here. It's a standard image gallery, div, slider, images. Nothing too special here. And this slick looks like a little library for actually doing the transitions and keeping track of the number of slides and so on. Then down here we've got the class do transition. Like, what does that do? It seems to be adding and removing the do transition effect. I suspect it's probably the animation. If I go find an image and add, do transition, and I toggle it, whoosh, it does the little animation that's interesting. So we can just dig into that. If we look in the CSS, so do transition is an animation called motion blur, which lasts for 0.1 seconds forwards, then afterwards, after the delay, 0.4 seconds reverse. Quickly run forwards and then reverse it back again for half a second. The whole thing lasts half a second. I guess when you click, whoosh, half a second is gone. Okay, so what does the motion blur animation do? You can see here it's a keyframe animation, meaning the percentages. It's easy to keep track of just at what point from 0 to 100% it's going to apply different CSS properties. But all it's doing really is filter URL and then a transform property. You can see at 15% it switches to blur 1, at 30% blur 2, blur 3, 4. The scale never goes crazy, but it kind of veers up slightly. I guess that's the x-axis, so it's kind of getting wider as part of that blur, and then it looks like it gets slightly shorter. So there's a stretching as part of that motion blur, which makes sense. 75% through to 100, it's blur. 75% through to 100, it's filter blur 5. And that's the most extreme scaling. So what's happening with this filter effect? Generally, CSS filters, most people are familiar with them for those kind of quick image effects. So there's like blur, but there's saturate, hue adjustments, all these kind of quick kind of overlay type styles you can make on images to kind of quickly change the colors or change how they display slightly. But you don't commonly see them with URLs. So we find a slide here, directly apply the filter URL, what happens? Nothing much. If we change that to 2, aha, it's applying. So I guess it's just going to go up in intensity. If we go to 4, so just going to go to more and more. So what is going on? If we look at the images, there's nothing, but those are defined here. So there is an SVG which has a series of definitions of filters. Each one has an ID, which is how it's referenced, and it looks like the animation really just iterates through them all. So just says start with 0, go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over those percentages. So basically an animation, it's like a stop frame animation. You're just saying show this blur, then this blur, then this blur. Just keep intensifying the blur while we're stretching the image. And because it happens so quickly, you don't really notice that kind of jolty animation. It just kind of looks like it just stretches, blurs, pushes it out the page. The motion kind of helps that motion blur effect. In terms of what we're actually using, it's called FE Gaussian blur with some values being passed into it. So what is this? What's happening? So it's something called SVG filters, which I'm completely unfamiliar with. I generally think of SVG as kind of those kind of drawings that you can define with math, and you can give them parameters, and because they're kind of drawn on the page, you can obviously animate them, and you can pass the values and adapt them and make them do kind of impressive things. But it's not often about SVG as a filter. This article here is talking about different effects you can make for text, but it seems to generally infer the same thing. That is to say, you apply a filter with a URL, then you have to define your filter with that ID and what effect it's going to take. However, it's using primitives, the building blocks of SVG filters, how many effects which contain this one primitive. So there's kind of a whole separate language here. It's a little bit, if you start working in GSL shaders and that kind of thing, it can let you do these awesome effects, but it's not an extension of any sort of standard web technology stuff. You can't just learn it like CSS. It's a whole separate library and a whole separate logic system mindset to get used to. However, the curious thing is that FE Gaussian blur is not defined here. It's not imported as a component or as a separate library. There's no access to that. So it actually turns out FE Gaussian blur is actually just a native SVG filter that you can pass, or that you can create. It's its own element that you can give these standard deviation. You can give it these standard deviation numbers to specify how much blur you want to add to them. So here is an actual circle SVG element being given that filter. Drop shadow example. So basically you can just create an element with that value. And FE Gaussian blur is supported in all the main browsers. And there's a whole bunch of these. Look up the SVG element reference. Again, when you're learning about SVGs, you kind of do the basic shapes and colors, and anything more complex, you kind of just defer to some sort of library. But there's all kinds of attributes and filters that you'd be able to create and pass in. So if you're looking for any kind of super complex overlay on an image that a CSS animation can't do, this is one option. Anyway, that's a whole world of its own, and it's something worth investigating further if you want to kind of learn about SVG and how you can combine SVG and use in animations. But that's sort of quite eye-opening, I think. That's all for today's investigation, case closed. Go and have a nice day.